Welcome to this webinar, Digitization, Data, and Delivery, Understanding the ROI Behind Digital Pathology. I'm Ken Dees, your host and Chief Marketing Officer of Intuitive. Your presenters today are Imogen Fitt, Senior Market Analyst of Signify Research, and Colin Murphy, CEO of Intuitive. They will each introduce you to their respective firms, beginning with you, Colin.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks all for watching today. I'm the CEO of Intuitive, as Ken mentioned. Intuitive provides clinical reporting solutions with a focus on capturing structured data. We're going to use that structured data downstream for myriad different purposes. Our goals really are to improve care for patients and workflows for clinicians. For purposes of today's discussion, we're going to focus on talking about Intuitive's role in digital pathology and the adoption thereof. Diagnostic workflows for pathologists are evolving into a digital-first system. Dr. O'Toole, our founder, used to say that the image is the data. Metadata are the descriptions and the details about the images. Those are what become your clinical report that goes off to the oncologist. In the digital-first world, at the time of the pathologist review, case details and some context are already available to the computer. So additional metadata can be extracted using various tools like AI algorithms. The pathologist's job now is evolving. First and foremost, they still must deliver a patient report, but now advancements in technologies are equipping them with much more formidable tools that never existed before. So pathologists are going to be tasked with adopting these new tools at the same time their workload is expanding and their reporting requirements are ever changing. Intuitive is trying to ease that burden. Our users are trying to maintain all the requirements of them for reporting for CDP compliance, for Commission on Cancer accreditation. In order to do that, they need to follow standards. And we're going to use the new digital pathology tools to speed that process, auto-populate information into those reports, and then prepare that metadata so it can be used further downstream. We've been around now for more than 2 decades. We've worked very closely with partners and professional organizations and our customers to build robust processes to maintain expert systems that are going to drive those reporting workflows. We're active with standards bodies that are defining ways to share information and better coordinate care. Our flagship products are used, Intuitive Pathology, CAP-E form, used in hundreds of hospitals worldwide now. That's a little bit about us. I'm excited to be sharing this podium here with Imogen Fitt from Signify. I'll hand it over to her.
So Signify Research is a healthcare and technology-focused market intelligence organization that's based in the UK, but also global in our overview. Our market research reports are used by large healthcare technology stakeholders in order to shape their strategy and ease the transition of different kinds of emerging technologies into the clinical domain and into the clinical market. I sit within the diagnostics and life sciences team here at Signify Research, and I cover digital pathology exclusively. So chatting to both digital pathology vendors, but also adjacent stakeholders, such as in the LIS domain and the infrastructure domains, in order to understand more about how digital pathology is being used today and also where it's evolving and how it's going to look in the next 10 years. So one of the most important things to understand about the digital pathology market today is that in a post-COVID environment, the market is accelerating like it has done before. 2020 instigated quite a sharp shift to remote workflows for many pathologists, and consequently, the surge in adoption that has followed has meant that there isn't a lot of prior case studies for new adopters of the technology to learn from in such an easy way. There are places that other healthcare technology markets that we can look to, like radiology. But today there are still very few laboratories worldwide that are in clinical settings which process close to 100% of their own samples. And we're including both cytology and anatomic, and that are processing them today. So as many of those new adopters are sort of in the 10 to 5% volume range, there's a lot of lessons that we can learn in order to set ourselves up for success over the next couple of years. And the question of, what is the actual return on investment for digital pathology is now front of mind for many of the labs that are adopting. There's a lot of questions in the industry. I don't know. Do you think that the digital pathology market growth is going to continue? Are we going to see the market adopt digital pathology and keep it going that way now that COVID is not such a prominent concern?
I do. I think COVID obviously kind of hastened the need for digital pathology, remote work. It was taking a long time to gain adoption in the first place, and then everything has to do with the ROI. You're not replacing anything in the lab by digitizing your slides. It's an additive procedure.
Yeah.
Right? You're putting a whole slide imaging machine into your scanner into your lab. Your slides still have to go through histology before they get scanned. Not only are those machines very expensive, but you're adding to the workforce, the overhead, in order to manage those. However, that being said, I think there's going to be some major forces that are going to increase that adoption. Well, first is the macro effect, where you've got shrinking pathology population, but more incidence of cancer. You've got the explosion of new types of diagnoses, from molecular diagnostics, from personalized medicine. That is adding to the workload of the pathologist. So you've got this massive amount of work that needs to be done. We're going to need to figure out how do we become more efficient. And I think the adoption of digital pathology is going to be that answer. Second piece is competition. With that explosion of new work that needs to be done, somebody's got to do it. So even though you've got a shrinking workforce, you're going to have portions of the workforce that are going to take on more of that burden. And they're going to get paid to do it. So with that additional revenue coming in, you're going to see people being forced to actually invest it. So between the that additional work and the need for efficiencies, you're going to see digital pathology be where they invest it in. And how that efficiency happens, I guess, is the question, right? Have we proven that ROI yet?
I guess we're also at a sort of an inception point in general for healthcare technology when we look at the opportunity that is suddenly available with development of AI. And where, decades, even a couple of years ago previous, you didn't have the kind of sophisticated technologies that you can now apply to imaging. And I think that further does open up new opportunities with digitization that maybe aren't as immediately obvious when you move and shift digital workflow, but applying those kinds of image analysis techniques using, deep learning or generative AI, which obviously is going to affect the clinic anytime soon, but does offer some very interesting long-term applications. You didn't have that in a pre-pandemic era either. And I think that is something that is also going to help to continue driving the market forward as well today. You mentioned, some of the sort of the competitive element and what are some of the challenges. And obviously, I think one of the most significant barriers to market growth previously was the huge upfront investment that came when you decided to go digital and purchase scanners, purchase IMS, worry about storage. It was an additive, as you mentioned. So it wasn't replacing budget with the same budget. You have suddenly had to source more. And I think that's something that's very front of mind for the market now in terms of how do we address that to continue promoting that growth. Obviously, there's other challenges as well. From your perspective, what would be the next most prominent, I guess?
Challenge,
yeah.
For adoption, well, I do think cost is first and foremost the biggest challenge. Where is this money going to come from to make the investment? As we have talked about, there are macro effects with an exploding amount of work that's going to create additional revenue streams. I think that's where the ROI initially is going to come in.
Yeah.
making the assumption that you just made, right? That AI is going to deliver on those efficiencies. And if it does, then you're gonna create a competitive atmosphere where there's going to be more people that need to adopt it in order to stay in the game.
You have that as well today in terms of attitudes of the workforce and what they demand. So pathologists don't necessarily want to have to travel to the office today, and there is interest in digital pathology in allowing those remote workflows still, even in a post-COVID era where we don't have to work from home. We want the flexibility with it. So there is, from what I've heard in the market, a transition that's going on, especially in private domains, where in order to retain talent and retain their workforce, in as you said, it's a shrinking workforce, the labs themselves are having to digitize to offer that flexibility to their employees. And that's, even before we get to AI.
Yeah, and I kind of call that the cool factor, right? if I'm going to go work somewhere, I want to be able to use the latest and greatest tools. I want to be able to do it from home. I don't want to have to drive into the office to make it happen. So completely agree. Now, does that immediately result in dollars? Probably more so in the private domain. Absolutely. Public domain, much of dollars may be more difficult to come by. But once those ROIs are proven out, that this can generate more revenue. And we talked about just the additional work, creating more revenue. Yeah. We haven't even talked about the real world data yet, right? Yeah. So when you get there, there's going to be additional revenue streams that are going to open up for those hospitals, those pathology practices to take advantage of.
Yes, and I guess future-proofing those investments is probably one of the bigger questions that is in place in the market right now. It's because there's not a lot of prior case studies and there's not a lot of examples in pathology. We can look to other healthcare markets. There's almost a question of there is no examples for me to look at where many labs have taken many steps forward. How is it that I make sure that the decisions that I'm making today aren't going to be something that I regret in the next, 5 years, because the pace of technology and innovation today is so great. And I think there's a few things that we can probably talk to about that later down the line, and that's to do with, structuring data, with making sure that you're standardizing very early and you're having the kind of right attitude that will enable you to just be as flexible as possible, essentially, moving forward. I don't know whether you have anything to add.
No, I'm glad you used those words: standardization, flexible. These are core components to what Intuitive is delivering as a solution, but it's going to be core going forward to be able to glean any value out of that real world data. You need to be able to normalize your data sets across years, but the standards are going to continue to change. What I need to put in my clinical report, how medicine is practiced, what's important. What are the known significance to molecular diagnostics? As that changes, there's going to be additional and ever-changing requirements for what goes into your report. But there needs to be a standard that's followed, and you need to continually follow that standard going forward, again, so you can future-proof the value of that data that's being captured today, 10 years from now.
Yeah, I agree. So let's stop a minute and talk about the digital pathology workflow in itself, because as I mentioned, digitization is definitely not straightforward. There are many different software systems and aspects of the process that labs need to consider before they start going forward. Within this kind of the diagram on screen shows that even before we start the scanning process, there's this pre-digital analysis that needs to be considered. That's in terms of, standardizing the way that we prepare the slides before they even get scanned, because that can affect the way that artificial intelligence is able to be applied afterwards. Once you get to this clinical and the scanning element of it, there's also questions around how we properly integrate those IT systems in a cohesive manner that's ergonomic and sort of intuitive for users. So I think one of the main takeaways from my research was that when digital pathology users adopted digital workflows, they needed to have very tight integration with different IT systems, primarily the LIS as well. If that wasn't occurring in a sort of a bi-directional, fully integrated manner, you would have situations where you'd have to input data twice. Nobody wants to do that. I don't have the patience really to input data once into my phone. I'm doing that sort of thing. And I think moving forward, understanding those ergonomics and understanding how it is that we make our software as easy to use as possible for the users is very important. EHR burnout, that's absolutely, that's a known situation in the industry. Pathology is obviously just embarking on the digital imaging journey, and that's been around for ages. But we should definitely proceed with that in mind in order not to create, learn lessons from other healthcare markets.
I think if you look back at the history of how pathologists have worked, it wasn't that long ago that they were dictating and having a transcriptionist type out their reports. That was seen as fairly simple, and you still have pathologists who practice in medicine for a long time who still utilize that because it became part of the way they report. Now that we've introduced meaningful use in the U.S., other requirements elsewhere, this whole requirement to put more information in the EHR, having the doctors be the ones that are responsible for doing that, that has changed the game. No longer can you just dictate and have a paragraph transcribed. In pathology, you need to follow synoptic reporting standards and you to comply. That has created an additional burden, whether that's perception or reality. There's definitely, it definitely exists. Change in the workflow. There was additional information that needed to be put in a specific way. It added time to that reporting process. With the introduction of new technologies like digital pathology and AI, we're now going back the other direction. Yes, we're still going to have these requirements. We're still going to have these standards. But how do we automate as much as that as possible?
Yeah.
As I'm interacting with that image, can I just extract that metadata and have it pre-populate into a protocol so that I don't have to use the keyboard and mouse to type it in?
And there's so many different ways that AI can be applied across the digital pathology workflow, as you mentioned. Either from, the most obvious is obviously the image analysis for the eye,
right?
To offer the decision support. But there's vendors out there with solutions that address both the scanning methodology in terms of offering that automatic QC down to sort of the pre-triaging. So I can dictate which cases are going to be more urgent before they're even seen by the pathologist. I can structure work lists based on how to managing my work staff's time and essentially making it much more efficient. Beyond that, there's also the issue because obviously digital pathology, the life cycle doesn't stop at diagnosis. Now, there's a fair few labs out there today that unfortunately delete the images. And that's based on, constraints to do with costs and other types of things. But once you start retaining those images, then you then have to make the decision of, am I going to retain them and use them as am I going to bother with second opinions and putting those images in archives? Once you put them in archives, you can draw them back, use them for either educational purposes or there's solutions out there which, if you're struggling with a case, you can use AI to search your database and pick up every single case similar to that. So you can find a prior diagnosis, look up all of the associated information and essentially learn from that. Those kinds of applications are quite exciting as well. I don't necessarily, they're not the most obvious when you first start that digitization journey. There is also other considerations such as how do I store my data, and et cetera, et cetera.
Sure, but it's almost circular too, though, right? Because you've got machine learning models that need to be validated.
Yeah.
They're much more easily validated if you've got structured, annotated images that are there in the archives. Once you delete those and any link between the metadata is severed, you have to go back and do it again.
And that's primarily why digital pathology is such an intersection between the research and clinical worlds. and why it's so important to retain those images so that you can derive better insights, essentially. And that's the opportunity that going digital in the long term really offers, isn't it? It's not necessarily, as we mentioned before, being able to work remotely, but it's also, I'm now collecting databases of prior cases, and I can derive new insights, stratify my patients further, and really get to what is ultimately the goal of precision medicine.
It is. There's
a lot to consider with it as well. I think one of the challenges in the industry today, and one of the terms that's used, and I mentioned this before, was interoperability. And as we talk about creating these archives of data that we can use, it's also important to highlight that if we want to use that data, we need to be able to store it in formats where we can access it and analyze it at scale. One of the most prominent things is standardization, and there's different aspects of standardization. I won't touch on all of them, but for digital pathology, the primary concern at the minute is imaging formats. So there are plenty of proprietary scanners, proprietary formats that were produced when the scanners were first launched on the market. However, the market start to evolve and incorporate itself more into the clinical domain, DICOM is one of the ones that's emerged. And DICOM is quite an interesting standard because it also contains what's termed as metadata, which can be applied later on those in those studies for real world data. So on the screen is an example of essentially what kind of information is included in the DICOM file. The standard metadata, but there's also optional data that can be used to help input it to research queries and things like that.
And also the optional stuff is where I get really excited, right?
Yeah.
The DICOM isn't DICOM without that standard structured metadata.
Yeah.
But once you start introducing the annotations and the information about the specific images or regions of interest, that's what's being captured with the structured data products like Intuitive.
Yeah.
That's what, we've had that mentioned education before. We've had that vision of being able to reuse slides that have been diagnosed for education for a long time. And it's a very simple way to think about how do I get value out of the diagnostic process that I'm following today. It's not, I guess technically it is available in the analog world, but you're going and you're pulling slides with a report and trying to figure out where on the slide you have to look. Now you can digitize the whole thing in a simple software system that will be able to pull those images directly to the computer.
And it just becomes a lot quicker, doesn't it? In the analog world, you'd have to sit there, you'd have to make the annotations, you'd have to fill out your forms. AI is obviously one of the things that could make it a lot quicker and easier, but you need the structured data to make the most of it, I guess. And that's, I guess, one of the considerations that we have in our research is where is digital pathology and digital pathology workflow going to be in the next 5 to 10 years? And as I mentioned, we are seeing the DICOM standard emerge as the standard of interoperability. Today, I'd argue that structure in the LIS in any kind of lab is not something that's very commonplace, but it is the need and the requirement and the interest in it is definitely growing. I guess in the next couple of years, where do you see the workflow evolving, and what do you see being the most prominent change?
I think from a workflow perspective, at least where M2 and our software applications fit in, it really is about extracting that metadata from the image automatically. We have had a lot of conversations recently with digital pathology players, IMS companies that have viewers. They want to make sure that they maintain the look and feel, single vendor workflow aspect, and which is great. It's smart way to look at solving the problem, but in order to get all of that information that you need and make sure that it's in compliance with all the standards, that it's maintaining the standards going forward, there has to be some system in the background that's going to kind of manage that. And that's kind of where we see ourselves fitting in. We don't necessarily be the UI, but we're going to be managing that data capture process in the back end, making sure that the data is usable downstream.
You need to be integrated, because I don't like pop-ups in anything I do. I can't imagine being at work and having to deal with them at all. So I guess the next thing to talk about is that as we look to kind of the future of digital pathology, is one of the most prominent kind of challenges that's going to emerge in the industry, and it's the question of what do we do with all that data? Because the whole slide images, to give you kind of an overview, they are magnitudes bigger than anything that is in healthcare at the minute. And at the rate that we, process slides and samples, even so radiology and cardiology have got to be the biggest, uses and storage vehicles for healthcare imaging today. And pathology, if you look at like an average lab, is easily going to outstrip that. And currently today, a lot of digital pathology users haven't necessarily got to that point in their journey where they've had the budget or had to even consider what they're going to do. So there's a lot of deletion. But what else is there? You can store on premise. You can store on physical hard drives, CDs, USBs. I wouldn't recommend that long term, because quite quickly that can get expensive. On premise in existing infrastructure, VNAs is something that's been spoken about, because a lot of radiology pathology partnerships have emerged over the last couple of years with the idea that you could potentially use the VNA, vendor neutral archive, to store digital pathology images. There's also the cloud, which is obviously the most flexible long-term option, but there's a lot of concerns around cloud in terms of security and the total cost of ownership, and whether or not it is, how much budget am I going to have to allocate before, without necessarily understanding things like what if I need to record? What if I need, what kind of egress fees are going to be associated with that? Hybrid seems to be the most popular, and is sort of the method that Signify Research is seeing going forward. But as you collect those archives of data and you start structuring them, you need to understand more about how you want to use that data, because how you choose to store it is going to really impact how easily you're able to use it.
Right.
And I think that's the main thing that I would sort of say to lab adopters today is, when you're finished implementing your workflows, think about it, but bear in mind how long term you want your storage practices to evolve.
Yeah, and hopefully I'd like to see there be a way to extract value out of the images that can be stored longer term in a more efficient way than having to archive an entire set of slides. Smart people may are going to have to figure that out, but the cost is coming down for storage, and it continues to do so. But like you said, the sizes we're talking about are things that never really been considered before. So it's going to be a long time before it's cheap enough to store everything.
It's definitely something to talk to your IT departments about. But there's, like you said, smart people than us. They are working on things like compression algorithms. There's different tiers, and some of the vendors like Google or AWS or Microsoft, they're all getting their heads together and thinking, how can we enable this image storage, because we want to be able to facilitate it, because we understand the implications of what you can do with that data once it's started to be collected. You talk about things like tiers and pricing, but that's a conversation for another time, I think.
Yeah.
So I've spoken a lot about storing data, and that there is associated value sort of with retaining those images. However, I haven't really spoken about why we bother. we've talked about AI, we've talked about applying intelligence to it. There's a lot of different uses for digital pathology images. You mentioned previously, like training AI tools, feedback loop that occurs within that. Those can multiply into things like using digital pathology images within multidisciplinary tumor boards, where using them in terms of care coordination and management, there's kind of the logistical elements of it, being able to evaluate how quickly my slides and my cases are processed so that I can help improve the pathologist from a workflow perspective. There's the academic elements in terms of contributing internally to research initiatives or externally in things like, there's major EU-funded programs that are looking at understanding cancer biomarkers from digital pathology images. There's also things like, how do I facilitate that interconnection between the preclinical and clinical world? Maybe I do it by applying AI so that I can identify candidates that may be eligible for clinical trials. Things that may not be as obvious as initially thought towards for the use of that. And there's a multitude of different users of digital pathology data. Those include a lot of different types of personas. So AI startups we mentioned. Pharma wants to use it to enable their precision medicine initiatives. They want to use it, digital pathology, to inform drug development right from the beginning to the very end in post-market surveillance, making sure that, everything's sort of sound once the drug's made it out to market. There's CROs, there's also public health bodies, there's also, admins and payers. So how can I use digital pathology data to measure whether or not I think that enough of the change has been made in order to check the box okay for reimbursement? I guess there's so many.
These are all potential areas of funding too, right? I mean, we talk about the cost being the biggest barrier to adoption digital pathology.
Yes.
Once you start talking about all the possible uses of the data that's going to be created from basically just the use of digital pathology, right? There's so much value to that for different walks of life. If you can start figuring out how to get creative to begin these programs by getting funding from some of these other groups, it could hopefully see adoption. And obviously it already has in the pharma space, right?
Yeah, and real world data is a really interesting trend that's going on across healthcare at the minute, because I think there is an ROI that's associated with offering de-identified access to data. And there's lots of vendors out there that are offering, data aggregation platforms that are able to extract data directly from healthcare institutions, automatically make sure that it's as depersonalized and unidentifiable as possible, but also help act as like a third party to help those institutions realize monetary value from that data.
Right.
And that in turn can be reinvested in supporting drug development initiatives and also reinvested in the hospital or the healthcare institution itself, so they can essentially fund a digitization process. Standardization and the structured reporting, that adds another element of information on top of the image that's going to be initiatives. And beyond that as well, you have multimodal data. So not just the digital pathology image by itself, but in the context of the rest of the healthcare record. And that is where the real appetite is in terms of what the life sciences and what those third parties are looking for in order to understand the pathology and the condition and the human individual condition as acutely as possible.
Yeah, I think multimodal for sure. We used to, and Dr. O'Toole used to talk about having he felt that he was practicing 20 years after he retired, that no longer would he be a surgical pathologist. He saw himself as a master diagnostician, where he would have, and I don't necessarily know that we're go in that direction yet, but he saw An image is an image, whether that's an X-ray or an MRI, or if it's a whole slide image. The job of the diagnostician is to take all of that information, figure out what it means, and put it into a patient report so that the treatment can begin. And that explodes even more when you start talking about OX and you start talking about molecular information.
It's exciting. So how can we ensure that labs themselves are able to sort of capture the full value from a digital pathology investment? I guess there's a few questions that kind of lead on from that. What is needed to make the most out of data? Now, I would say that some of the key points are structure. So you need to be able to have the data that's structured, so that's easily interpretable at scale by AI and easily sort of understood. And structuring applies, harmonization, the use of standards, all of that sort of good stuff. There's also aggregation, so you need to be able to collect it at scale. It's all good very well to structure it, but if you delete it after a while, the value that you can derive is limited. Obviously, don't keep all unnecessary images, but even if it's starting by choosing a few of the more interesting cases and slowly building up from there, with the view to long-term creating large archives where you can understand or derive insights. There's also annotation within that. There's scope and all sorts of other things. Do you think, if you could just chat, what is the most important thing about making the most out of your digital pathology data?
Both. This is a little self-serving, I guess, but I live this every day. When I think of the images that are being captured and how do we use those images for additional purposes beyond the initial diagnosis, I'm going to rely heavily on that structured data. And you mentioned it, when you say structured data, what does that mean? You've got to be following a standard, and that standard has to be maintained going forward, because you don't want, if you've got one instance of data that follows a standard and then your next instance of data follows a different standard, then you're not going to be able to aggregate that together, especially when you look at it over a mass scale.
And that isn't just exclusive to sort of the image file formats that we mentioned previously, is it? It's sort of terminology, and there's a lot of different coding across healthcare. So codes, they process essentially the same procedure, but they look different on paper, and to AI, not going to be able to discern, even if there's one off, and you could miss a large point. There's lots of different aspects to structure, isn't there?
There are, and John Shrigley is a pathologist, Canadian pathologist, who has defined the 6 levels of SNOP reporting. I'm actually at the 7th now, which I just learned about recently. But the idea is, that's that 6th level is really getting to a place where you've got an ontologic understanding of what the data represents. We're not there yet, but we're making strides. The called pathologist electronic cancer protocols have now been encoded with SNOMED CT. That's just been published, and it's been shared with HL7, so it's going to be a worldwide standard going forward. The same thing's going to happen with the other standards that are out there, reported standards for ICCR, for World College of Pathologists, World College in Australasia. Whether it's SNOMED or another set of codes that end up being used. But however you determine you're going to use SNOMED or a specific ontology, the idea that you've got a normalization of data over years following the same standard, even though that standard's got to remain flexible, and it will change from time to time, you've got to be able to normalize that information so that you can use it in an aggregate format.
Great. Real world examples of where this has been sort of set up at its most sophisticated. Do you have them?
There's a few. The Netherlands is a great example. Paul has put together a program over there where they're able to get a diagnosis following a specific standard for every cancer that's diagnosed over there. Good.
And the Netherlands is a great example of some very sophisticated digital pathology in general implementations where they're integrating genomics data. There's almost what is evolving is this pathologist cockpit where the information from the LIS, the radiology, the EHR is all coming together to support diagnosis. I get quite excited about that, so it doesn't surprise me that they're doing a lot with structure and with a long-term view to compile and understand that information.
I hate to come back to the funding, right? But,
yeah.
But when you look at it from on a macro scale, other examples I'll give are in Canada. It's socialized medicine. UK, they're starting to do a lot of work with the COSD requirements here. If you look at in British Columbia, we were lucky enough to sign a provincial agreement with British Columbia. So every diagnosis, every cancer that gets diagnosed by a pathologist in British Columbia, they use the Intuitive software to do it. A copy of that information supplemented with a feed of case level information from the LIS gets sent to a centralized repository. And that centralized repository they're using for myriad different purposes now. They're using it as a staging area to get it into their research databases in their cancer registry system. They're using it to identify patients for trials. They're using it to measure quality metrics. The Canadian Partnership Against Cancer had about 100 different metrics that they wanted provinces to start to measure. And they put together a dashboard so that not only pathologists, but surgeons, there's a lot of times where you're measuring results from pathology, it has to do with how the specimen was taken out. They're able to present information back to individuals and department heads that show them where they need to improve or where they need to invest more in education, or there's operational needs, and there's definitely clinical needs as well to that quality data.
And that comes down to sort of the indirect return on investment that you can derive from these sort of things. I think that was going to be my next topic for you, answer that.
Great. Didn't mean to preempt it, but was there anything else you wanted to add?
I'm sure I'm interrupted.
Okay, good. We've got a few slides that we'll run through the screen, more about kind of Intuitive and our role. We've talked a lot about this already, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on these slides, but the idea that we're looking to support going forward, whether it's an adoption of a new technology or a new way of doing things, the idea that we really want to focus in on is if we're creating, first of all, what's going to be best for a patient, right? And when we talk about digital pathology, there are efficiencies that are going to be seen that are going to make the pathologists more efficient. They're going to get more work done. They're going to quality metrics are going to be assured, so you know that the information is accurate that's being put into the patient files. And it's going to open up opportunity for more learning to happen. So more molecular diagnostics are going to be available and put to good use because what the pathologists are learning. Can you go back real quick? Yeah, so and then the other one, which we spent a lot of time talking about, is population health. It's going to be important to structure information that is going to be used on an aggregate basis. You need to normalize that information and make sure you understand the context of individual cases so that it makes sense across an aggregate. When we talk about Intuitive solutions, we're not focused just on pathology, although obviously we're talking here about the adoption of digital pathology and those barriers. So we focused a lot of that conversation there. If you think of the reporting process and how it exists in diagnostic medicine anywhere, the process is the same. You've got a establish a protocol that you're going to follow. You have to follow that protocol to create a clinical report, and then you have to have an audit trail to show that you followed that protocol. That process is a well managed data collection process. 30 years ago, it wasn't as well managed. There was a lot of dictation, and we didn't, and transcription, we weren't really sure if all the information was in a final report that should be there. There was a lot of variation between pathologists and departments on what they were reporting. That's now going away. With the adoption of synoptic reporting and making sure that you're following a specific standard and improving that you're following that standard so that you can be accredited for information on cancer or whatever it is. It's creating an opportunity for us to gather data that's going to be much more valuable downstream. When I talk about downstream, there's a lot of ways shown on the slide here. Whether we're sharing that information with public health agencies or with data warehouses where special projects might be run by departments or by communities. There's lots of different potential uses for that data. Analytics, looking at just the analytics of the information that's being captured in structured reports is one. But we also don't see that as being an end-all be-all solution. Every hospital's got a data strategy. Every community healthcare system has a data strategy. Intuitive sees ourselves as being part of that larger data strategy. And Intuitive Insight is our analytical database that, you can run reports on the Intuitive Insight database. You can create dashboards. We've got a lot of purpose-built reports that solve specific clinical or operational, or answer specific clinical or operational questions. And there's room for ad hoc reporting built in there too. But honestly, there's other reporting systems out there that are already solving a lot of the challenges that we solved when we were rebuilding it. So slap Power BI or Tableau on top of Intuitive Insight, and you can run a lot of those ad hoc reports. Share the Intuitive Insight data with a grander data strategy that includes information beyond diagnostic medicine. That's where it becomes really powerful. Some of those data-enabled use cases that we talk about, we've mentioned all of them already today, or at least the ones that are on the slide. When looking at identifying patients for trials or candidate data sets for research, looking into validating machine learning models. It's kind of a very circular conversation. In order to create those models, you need structured annotated slides in order to validate them. And this is a solution, a full ecosystem of a solution that's going to help you do that. So what is an ideal digital pathology experience? Again, this is focused on Intuitive, right? When Dr. O'Toole came to us 20 years ago when we were starting the company, his vision was he wanted to sit down at his microscope, at his monitor, have everything he needed at his fingertips to complete his patient report. His job was to create that patient report and make sure that the oncologist knew how to interpret it so that they could treat the patient appropriately. However, he also had 7 other places that he wrote down on the oral whiteboard where he wanted to send that data. And when I say that data, it might have been a superset of information. It might have been a subset of data. It might have been taking that information and creating a report specifically for the patient. So, we talked a little bit about different ways to use AI and looking at large language models, right? There's ways to incorporate that into incorporate GPT and large language models into creating those types of patient reports that can be helpful. Being able to have that workstation or we call it cockpit, right? Being at that cockpit and having all the tools at your disposal that you need to becomes a very seamless experience. So I don't have to jump up and go grab a book off the shelf. I've got it built in my system. I've got my images right there. I've got all my tools that I need to take measurements or count cells or run ML models against those images right there at my fingertips. Once that what you are going through, as you're going through that diagnostic process, you've got to make sure that your reports are complete and you're following the standards of care. And this is very repetitive. I've said this a dozen times, but as you're first and foremost, you want to be in compliance with the latest and greatest standards of medicine so that you know your patients are getting taken care of, but you also do stuff for that data downstream. And doing stuff with that data downstream, and it's going to become a circular process where you're going to be able to use that data to improve the standards of care going forward. Imogen already mentioned this, right? We've done the data entry. We have to stay away from it. Let's figure out how to extract data from those images automatically so that I don't have to touch my keyboard and mouse. The computer's great at structuring information. That's got to be a goal. And then, these are great bullet points because it really is very repetitive. I guess, in having this conversation, we've already nailed this slide. So we've talked a lot about being able to link those images to structured data. Now you can identify not just cases that meet a certain profile, but you can pull those images back and circle, hone in on regions of interest that are going to help for education purposes or training models or whatever it may be. There's all kinds of things you can do with those images. So let's talk a little bit about that workflow. We'll get into the minutiae a little bit here. There are a number of standards that I can talk to. I'll try to stay away from that. It's not my forte, but those standards exist for a reason, and they're gaining more support and adoption. Things like Spar on Fire and Firecast, in order to publish and share information that could be used in real time by multiple systems. And we'll get into this. This slide is actually based off of a pilot study that we did a few years back in the United Kingdom. What the project here was we're looking at basal cell carcinoma, and we identified, I think, 24, 25 data points that we wanted to extract data from the image and automatically populate a checklist behind the scenes. So as I'm interacting with that slide, I'm extracting that metadata. And once I get context to that metadata, which can be done just by virtue of knowing what algorithm I ran or what measurement I took, it can pre-populate a protocol in the background. So you wouldn't actually even have to see the intuitive screen on your monitor. You're completing your report just by virtue of interacting with that slide. And it was we started out in skin cancer, obviously, but we're looking to do some additional projects as well. Imogen has a slide similar to this earlier, looking at analytical phases of digital pathology. And we are currently focused kind of on the right-hand side of that top graphic. There are areas where AI is going to be used on those digital pathology workflows earlier in the stage, making sure that the images are of quality, a certain quality, and the stains are done correctly. But when you get to the sharing of data with the reporting system, that's really what's taking place at the monitor when the pathologist is interacting with the screen, potentially also pre-analytically. So if you look at where the intuitive products are going to come into play, Imogen mentioned this earlier as well. With pre-analytically, there are algorithms that are going to run on a series of slides, series of cases that are going to prioritize which cases need to be looked at. So prostate biopsies is a good example, right? If you've got 100 cases of prostate biopsies, the vast majority of those are going to be normals. How do we know which ones we want to spend the most time on? Yesterday, you had to go and you had to look at 100 sets of slides. Nowadays, with the AI models that have been built, you're able to identify which ones the algorithm are going to recommend for further analysis because there's a prediction that there is cancer present. It can be super helpful in managing the the time for the pathologist and their energy they're going to spend on these cases. When that pre-analytical process runs, what are you doing? Well, you're extracting data from a series of images. Once you're extracting data from those images and you're able to give it context, you can start to populate a checklist automatically. So our system is there preemptively as those algorithms are being run. You can start the protocol, you can start filling out all the checklists. When the pathologist actually sits down at the microscope, or sitting at the monitor, they're going to have a protocol that's already partially filled out, right? And that's where we get to the real-time analysis. A lot of different tools that are going to be available in the viewer for the pathologist to extract additional information out. So maybe we've filled out, say, half a protocol pre-analytically before the pathologist looks at those slides. Then you can start to extract additional information out using those tools that the viewer is going to allow you, which typically would have been manual in an analog process. And then once the reports are completed, synoptic reports are signed out, shared back with the LIS, which is a key component to what Intuitive's value proposition is here as well. We work with all of the LISs on the market. We have those integrations done. There's a series of challenges that the LIS solves that these digital pathology players are not going to focus on today. So that integration with the LIS, and you've mentioned this a couple of times as well, right? That's critical. It's critical for the IMS vendors and the viewers to be successful. Piggyback on the Intuitive solution, you've already got that integration done. And I think that's everything.
So I guess what we've learned today is that ultimately pathology and pathology labs are an inception point. They're about to take big steps forward into digitization. Some of them are already, a couple of steps in. But in sort of the grand scheme of things, we're at the very beginning of that digitization journey. There's not a lot of prior examples to learn from. And there is a return on investment that can be realized if you take the right steps very early on. Radiology had the same problem where they didn't standardize, and then it took a lot more work to do it later on. They eventually got to it. But pathology is at that point where it can look at that and go, okay, well, how do I do better the first time around? And some of the things we've talked about are considering the workflow, considering how you store the data, whether you store the data, what you're going to use it for, and when you store that data, how to make the most of it in terms of making sure that it's structured, making sure that it's, we can apply artificial intelligence to it later down the line, but not just artificial intelligence. There's obviously a lot of other reasons to structure data. But those decisions that are made quite early on, when you start building those databases and storing those images, can have quite a great impact later down the line. I mean, what are your key takeaways for everybody that was kind enough to listen?
I think I agree with what you're saying. And when you say early on, you want to start
Yes.
adopting, you want to start standardizing. And to do that, you've got to make decisions. And if you put off some of those decisions, then you're missing out on the potential for capturing that value of any digitized slides from the last 2 years. I'm sure you can always go back and do it, but let's make it part of the process today. Make it part of that primary diagnostic process. And then we can start to figure out how to glean information glean value, from that information that's being captured.
Yeah, I mean, how do you go about starting that? Because I'm a pathologist and I've worked through a microscope all my life, or I'm a lab stakeholder that's kind of charged with spearheading this initiative. What's the best way to ensure that I do that? As you said, I would say, make sure that you speak to your IT departments. They, first and foremost, will know quite a bit about infrastructure and requirements, and they'll be hand in hand with the radiology and other digitized departments so that when you're speaking to them about what you want to achieve and the reasons that you're adopting, they'll be able to add insights as well about the value that other healthcare markets have derived from taking those approaches early on.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. There are so many considerations to this. Everybody has to be aware of what's being made. That decision has to have input from whether it be IT or finance, right? You need to know that if I do this now, am I going to have budget to finish the project later?
Yeah.
Your pathologist users, your lab personnel, there's going to be training that's involved. There's new education that has to happen. So there's a lot of different things that go into just making the decision in the first place. Once you start doing it, you can tweak things.
Yeah. I guess that's the challenge then, isn't it? So my next thing would be, so if I was going to leave the listeners, watchers, anybody watching and paying attention, with anything, it's sort of one really good question to pose for your vendors when you're speaking to them, any of them, IMS, ScanHub, etc., is how are you going to ensure that in 5, 10 years time, I'm going to be in a better position, or I'm going to be prepared for that future when it's there. If I go with you now, and that'll bring up topics that we've touched on that are not the focus of the webinar, like interoperability, and how those vendors answer that question can determine, how much they are planning ahead for the future.
How do you hold them accountable to, right? You want to make sure that you can't really predict the future, but you do have people who have started down this road and have experience with some of those vendors. So listen to them. Listen to those folks who have begun their digital pathology adoption venture.
That's something I'm going to start doing, is asking everybody, where do you see pathology in 5-10 years time, and pushing back on how what that looks like at a very distinct level. IT departments, again, very good to involve them so that they can pick out the technical aspects that you and I are not so familiar with. Yeah, not today. Brilliant. In that case, I guess that's everything from a sort of a data and a digitization and long-term consideration standpoint that I would highlight today. But Colin, we've worked together previously, and I'm sure we're going to have many more discussions like this in the future. All I can say is that if you're interested in the topic and you want to challenge us on some of the things that we've said, do reach out.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us for digitization, data and delivery, understanding the ROI behind digital pathology. And thanks to our presenters, Imogen Fitt, Senior Market Analyst of Signify Research, and Colin Murphy, CEO of Intuitive. For more information from either or both, here's where you can reach them. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.